Hi everyone, this is our first foray into Egyptian history, and what I'd like to do is start off with our first object, which is really objects in this case, a series of kings lists. And I talked a little bit about in a previous lecture about dating systems and so on. And so what I thought I'd do is start off really the content of the course with looking at these kings lists. And all these photos are coming from Wikipedia. And I do want to say that this particular image that you're looking at comes from the king Seti the First Kings List, which I'll talk about in just a second. So really, one object that's really important in terms of the Kings List is this Greek manuscript. It was written by a scribe named Menetho, lived sometime in the 200s BC, and as I put here, he was an Egyptian priest. He obviously had access to written material from the ancient Egyptians, and what he ended up doing is making lists, a king's list, and again written in Greek, which we could read at that point, definitely. And what he did was he made this list and he broke it down into different categories in terms of who was ruling first, and then what dynasty was changing, and so on. And this had a really big impact on Egyptian history because it turns out we follow almost the same schematic, the same breakdown that Menetho did. Now, before we get into the actually King's List, it's really important to back up a step and talk about how on earth do we know anything about ancient Egypt, especially when it's written in hieroglyphics. So there's a stone you've probably heard of called the Rosetta Stone. It was discovered in Egypt in the late 1700s when Napoleon invaded Egypt. Along with troops, he took in a whole bunch of civil servants like historians and architects and so on. And what they ended up doing is sweeping through the country and drawing things, writing things down, taking sort of what we might call chalk copies of things. And they ended up discovering this stone. Now, it's in England because England came in and took over Egypt, kicked the French out. This is an extremely important stone in terms of really ancient history in general, but in specifically Egyptian history, because what it is, and if you can look really closely, you can see that there's sort of three registers. Let me see if I can write down this. So you have a register here, and you can see sort of a line that divides it here, and then another line here. Now, what we're looking at are three different languages. It turns out that it's three different languages that all describe the same thing. So at the top, you've got the Egyptian hieroglyphics, which no one can read. At the bottom, in the middle register, you've got an Egyptian form of language called Demotic. And then down at the bottom, you've got the Greek. Now, everyone could read Greek at this point. And so what they ultimately discovered, especially by a man named Champollion in 1822, is that what the Greek says is what the Demotic says, and what the Demotic says is what the hieroglyph said. And so you can imagine the excitement when people realized this, because we could not read the hieroglyphics before this time. So we knew about all the, most of the buildings in ancient Egypt and all of the pillars and things and everything that was written on, but nothing could be read. And so when a number of scholars, including Champollion, realized that the Greek is corresponding to the hieroglyphs, then they started working backwards and then realized we could read the hieroglyphs, and so they started issuing translations and so on. And so this is really why we know so much about ancient Egyptian history, because the language was transcribed or translated. Okay, getting back to the King's List. So we have a number of written material that lists the pharaohs or kings from ancient Egypt. One very important one is called the Palemo Stone. And as I put here, these lists list the pharaohs from first through the fifth dynasties. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but when the history of ancient Egypt is broken down by historians and archaeologists, it's divided into overall large time frames like the pre-dynastic period, the period before the pharaohs, and then the early dynastic period, and then you've got sort of the dynastic period, which is called the Old Kingdom, the first time where, a big chunk of Egypt was solidified, governed by a single government, and had a massive economy and built the Great Pyramids. So this Palemo Stone lists the pharaohs from the 1st through the 5th dynasties, and these tend to go into the early dynastic period, all the way up into the Old Kingdom. Sometimes the 5th dynasty is included in the Old Kingdom. But here's one list that we have listing the names of the pharaohs. We have another list called the Turin Canon, created later in Egyptian history in the New Kingdom, where it lists 300. Now, I've given you some names here, like Menes is thought to be the first king or first pharaoh. There's some debate about that. And then it goes all the way to the 7th dynasty. Now, what's interesting is that sometimes the scribes who are putting these things together, they don't list everyone. We haven't gone through any Egyptian history yet, but what we'll see is they left out kings during what's called the Hyksos period. And the Hyksos are people who lived outside of Egypt and came in and took over. So whoever put this list together said, wait a second, those people aren't Egyptians. And so this person didn't even write down the kings who were ruling during that period. We also have study the first kings list, and this is the image that I put at the very beginning for you. Now, they also do not have the Hyksos kings. Interestingly enough, there is a queen pharaoh named Hatshepsut, and a lot of pharaohs later refused to recognize her rule, and so she wasn't even listed in the rulers, even though it's clearly from history she is a ruler. And then you've got these, again, we haven't talked about Egyptian history, Amarna kings. This was a period when Egypt sort of changed its religion and so on, and later scribes didn't like that, so they removed the names of the rulers and left them out. Now, we know that there were rulers named during these periods, and so it's interesting, if we only had to rely on, say, Seti, the first king's list, we wouldn't know about Hatshepsut or Amarna. Now, luckily, there's other archaeology and other written texts that talk about these. You've got Ramses II king's list, another one. And, why do these matter to Egyptian history? Well, the biggest reason is, of course, you've got Menetho's list, which breaks down the kings in terms of different dynasties. So now what historians and archaeologists do is they date Egyptian history the same way that Menetho did, and then go back and use all those kings lists that we have to sort of place where pharaohs were ruling at different times. So you can sort of put together the time list. And I've shown you this list in another earlier lecture, where what's really happening is that during, I should have put the early dynastic period here, where you start to get these early names of pharaohs that we know of. And what's really interesting is usually the dynasties started at number 1, like the first dynasty. What they realize is that they're actually pharaohs or kings before the first dynasty. So now there's dynasty 0. And I didn't put all the dynasties here. You can find that in all of your textbooks that I've had. So, and I've already discussed, this is Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, and the New Stone Age, when people in Egypt started farming. And then you've got the Old Kingdom, and then each one of these is broken down further into dynasties. And I'm not going to cover all of this because I already talked about this particular slide in an earlier lecture, but this breakdown is really because of Menetho, written in the, when he was writing in the 200s BC. We're using the same sort of dating system, the breakup system that he did. Now, I will tell you, when you think about these things, ancient Egyptians didn't say, hey, I'm living in the Old Kingdom, or hey, I'm living in the first intermediate period, and so on. So this is something that historians have done. Obviously, Menetho is doing it, and then you have modern historians doing the same thing. Now, I will warn you that there are issues. There's lots of issues with these kings list. Sometimes there are just issues with the names, like what do the names actually, or who do these correspond to? Don't worry about memorizing anything like this. I just thought it was interesting that there are 5 elements to a name, and that it's usually the nomen, the second name, and the cartouche. And the cartouche is sort of a box with all the hieroglyphs in it. Sometimes they're broken up into registers, and then that could be the cartouche. And then there's all these different names, but usually the scholarship is pretty consistent in using the second name that are the most common ones. There are also problems with dating. So when you look at your sources, when I talk about different things, you'll see that certain pharaoh was ruling between 2000 BC and 1800 BC. Really, that could be about, usually you see a little twiddle, so about 2000 BC to about 1950 BC, or whatever the dating system is. So don't take these dates as being cemented in stone. There's also co-regency issues. So a co-regent, what that is someone who is ruling with somebody else. So usually it's a father, and then he appoints his son as co-regent, and that usually isn't indicated in the list of names of the pharaohs. So usually you have to go back to archaeology or written text to try and figure out what's going on. So sometimes that messes up the dates when these people are ruling. I've also mentioned, problems with where Egyptians didn't say I'm living in the first intermediate period. The problem with that type of label, and we haven't looked at the history yet, but it's usually when there's a breakdown, it's like we say intermediate as if it's, we know what happened before and know what happened after. But how is a better way to describe this when you're talking about ancient Egyptian history? And it's the same thing with labels that we call, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and then after all of this. So you have to really be careful with the labels and what they actually mean. Now, we do have, we're talking about Menetho and these King's List objects in terms of dating. So scholars have tried to put together the names of the pharaohs with what's going on in the other parts of Egyptian culture. One interesting way that was developed by a man named Flinders Petrie back in the 1800s is something called seriation. And it's really done through looking at pottery styles. So there are certain type of pottery styles that are developed at certain times. And we haven't talked about Naqada or late Naqada period at all. But what happens is that you can usually tell the date of something based on the pottery that you find in the same sort of level. So if you find a statue that you can't figure out what the date is, maybe you find some pottery with it. And maybe we do know the dates of the pottery. So it helps to determine, as I put here, relative dates of the sites, because nothing is certain. And sometimes pottery levels get mixed up for various reasons. Someone's digging and they drop some pottery in and they cover the hole, and it looks like it's an earlier form of pottery, and it may not be. But seriation helps with dating as well. And then there's ways that we also date. So there's radiocarbon dating. There's something called thermoluminescence, and I give you a little definition of those down here. And I talked about the dating system before with before present, so be really careful that these are usually dated before present. So getting back to the main object, which these lists of kings and Menetho, it's really important to remember the importance of this, because again, it helps us to date what's happening in ancient Egypt. Menetho did us a great service by listing the names of the pharaohs and sort of breaking them down into different dynasties and helping us understand where one dynasty ends and another dynasty begins, because sometimes these other kings lists that were written by the ancient Egyptians, they don't tend to say anything about that. They just list one pharaoh, one after the next. So anyway, this is object 1, where we talk about the different kings lists.